Distinguished speakers and guests, a very warm welcome to the Asia Center for Changemakers Forum 2025. Some of you may know me through the various research interviews that we've done together or from the philanthropy programs that we've run so far. But allow me to introduce myself once again. My name is Shazli. I am one of the qualitative researchers here at the Wealth Management Institute and the ACC. And I'm delighted to be your host for today. Now, before we kick off the forum, just a gentle reminder that this session is being recorded by our organizers here at the Philanthropy Asia Summit. Now, this afternoon's agenda will certainly be exciting, though I should caution there will not be any breaks in between. Apologies for that. So I do seek your understanding if we stick strictly to time. Nevertheless, I'm confident that time will fly by, and I can't wait for you to be challenged, to be inspired, and above all, come away with fresh ideas on how we can improve philanthropy here in Asia. Now, so without further ado, I'd like to invite CEO of Wealth Management Institute, Ms. Foo Mee-Ha, to set the stage for today's event. Please join me in warmly welcoming her. Mee-Ha, please.
Distinguished panelists, fellow changemakers, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all. Many of you here are familiar faces. You joined us in this very event last year, and it's a joy to welcome you back, and equally exciting to see many new faces, new friends, joining this community. ACC, Asia Center for Changemaker, is 1 year old. We launched it last year. It is the Wealth Management Institute, WMI's, latest initiative to build capacity for purposeful wealth, supported by Temasek Trust and PAA. What is our mission? Our mission is to help grow a vibrant, well-equipped ecosystem of change makers across Asia. People who are deploying capital, capabilities, and conviction to drive real-world outcomes. Today, we are meeting at actually, I would say it's a pivotal point when we talk about deploying private wealth. So on the one side, I actually think about what we want to do in terms of helping the world solve some of the most challenging issues. That it is actually at the point where it's facing huge challenges. I was just with Sir Jeremy Farah, the chief scientist of the World Health Organization, as well as the panel, talking about how the development agencies in health have been gutted, right? Like I think all of you have heard about the challenges that all these development agencies are seeing with funding withdrawn. So it is a difficult time with development aid cut back, ESG fatigue. All the traditional sources of funding for impact are severely under pressure. Even with our friends, I thought it's only in the USAID, but friends in Europe, UK was also talking about how aid has been cut back to fund defense. So everywhere is, having a big void. I think here in Asia, I hope, rather than have this room being so dark, so today we want to talk about what can we do in Asia. So I would say I like to see at every opportunity when there's darkness, there shall be light. And I think private wealth in Asia shall be the light for us. And I think many of you know it is growing at an extraordinary pace, even with the tariff, but I think with any estimates, Asia is leading the world in wealth creation with the growth of ultra-high net worth individuals outpacing both North America and Europe. So we have money. But yet, when it comes to giving, there's still enormous room to grow. Private wealth in Asia contributes about 24 billion annually, about a quarter of what US-based philanthropists give. At the same time, in our very own backyard, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific warns that our region remains over 30 years behind in achieving our key development goals. So lots of money, but actually there's a lot of catching up to do. A lot of money, but not deployed. So I think this presents a tremendous opportunity and a clear imperative. As wealth continues to rise, so must our ambition to channel it with greater purpose, strategy, and courage. So the question is no longer whether the capital exists, but how we unlock it effectively and at scale to drive meaningful, lasting impact. And to that end, today I'd like to share 5 key enablers we believe are critical in turning private wealth into a transformative force for good in Asia, areas where WMI and ACC hope to contribute meaningfully in partnership with all of you here. So the first one is about elevating the understanding of impact. Education. More wealth owners are actually seeking to act with purpose, but many still ask us when we see them, where do I start? What does good look like? How do I align my capital with my values and legacy? Next week, WMI is excited to kick off our Changemaker Impact Endeavor Fellowship Program, designed to support Asia's wealth owners in clarifying their purpose and amplifying their impact. Through this immersive learning journey, wealth owners will reimagine the role of capital, their relationship with their money. Really think hard. You got money, what's your relationship? Deep dive into the complex and evolving impact landscape and assess the viability and scalability of initiatives. They will also gain a deeper understanding of the range of philanthropic models that go beyond the traditional grant making. In Asia, over 80% is just simple grant making. But there are so many more ways they can give. These include exploring a continuum of approaches from impact investing to concessionary loans to mutual value in business, each offering different levels of risk, return, and social impact. Beyond Chief, WMI regularly convenes forums to build awareness and confidence, from showcasing the giving journeys of leading families to exploring practical tools such as donor advice fund, a simple way to get started, and the various tax incentives. These platforms provide a safe and trusted space for wealth owners to learn, reflect, and take their first or next step forward toward purposeful giving. Second, we need to professionalize philanthropy advising. We're just talking about that at our table. Professionalization of philanthropy advising. As more wealth holders seek to align their capital with purpose, they turn to trusted advisors. Who are they? Private bankers, family office professionals, lawyers, tax specialists, and so on. And so at WMI, we launched Asia's first certification for philanthropy advising, the Certified Impact Philanthropy Professional, CIPP, quite a mouthful. Very happy to share with everyone here, we are playing a small part. Nearly 350 professionals and client advisors has already been trained in the fundamentals of philanthropy advising, and 34 have completed full certification. Some of you are here with us today, I can see some of you here. So to build lasting credibility and trust in this emerging field, and I would say it's emerging in Asia, philanthropy advising must evolve into a recognized profession, grounded not only in technical knowledge, but also in strong ethical foundation. That's why together with our CIPP alumni, we're currently developing a code of ethics for philanthropy professionals, a foundational step toward establishing shared principles and standards of conduct for those advising wealth owners and supporting impact organizations. Our goal is simple: to ensure philanthropy advisors become the trusted source of guidance, empowered to help families to steward their wealth with integrity, accountability, and purpose. Sorry, I just recovered from a cold, so. Third, expand access to impact opportunities. I need to explain what this means, so I say this again because this is actually think it's a very important point. Expand access to impact opportunities. Access is one of the biggest barriers we must overcome. We often hear the scale of private capital needed to solve the world's most urgent challenges. I think climate change is one example. You always hear the billions and the trillions, for example. We always hear this number, right? Private capital is expected to provide nearly half of the 1.3 trillion needed annually by 2035. These are very big numbers. But the pathway for private wealth to participate is often unclear, especially for individual wealth owners trying to navigate the unfamiliar terrain. Many will ask us, where can I start? What opportunities match my values, my goals, and my level of risk tolerance? The truth is, access to solutions for impact is not yet easy or intuitive for many people who want to participate. There is often a lack of structured, visible, and well-matched opportunities that speak to the diverse profiles of wealth owners, from those new to philanthropy to experienced impact investors. So to bridge this gap, we really need to expand and better package access across a continuum of capital so that individuals can engage at different levels and grow their impact portfolios over time. I talk about portfolio, right? Yeah? So accessibility is key, and I see many of you in this room, such as advisors, banks, platforms, and ecosystem builders. You play a very vital role in bridging the gap between intention and action. Package the solutions in ways that people can participate. Because now it's a big number, big problems, but a lot of people say, yeah, I want to do it, but where do I start? I don't have Bill Gates kind of money, but I'm willing to do, maybe start with 100,000 or 1 million. Where do I start? I think that's been quite difficult when we hold talks. So accessibility is key. The fourth is, I think this is very intuitive for all of you, shift the narrative and spotlight leadership. Culture change. In Asia, I think we all know philanthropy has traditionally been quiet and private. But to accelerate momentum, we need more wealth owners to lead visibly, to share their journeys, their frameworks, and the lessons they've learned along the way. Peer learning is powerful, and I think especially powerful in Asia. It normalizes action, reduces hesitation, and inspires others to follow. So again, in this room, I would like to invite all of you to share with us role models, stories, and cases that deserve to be seen, so that together we can spotlight these journeys and inspire the next wave of emerging change makers across Asia. 5, the fifth one, foster collaboration and co-creation. It will take all of us working together to unlock the full potential of private wealth for impact. WMI is proud to partner the private banking industry group under the Impact Philanthropy Partnership with the support of MAS to grow a stronger and more trusted advisory ecosystem. And a big thank you to Temasek and PAA for convening the ecosystem to so powerfully this week through Ecosperity and PAS. And this is really a timely reminder that collaboration is not just important, it is essential. So friends, the opportunity before us is immense. And I think there's a big gap, and I think this is a time we can fill that. The wealth does exist. The intention is there. What we need is to build the capacity and the confidence to act at scale. This is not just about funding more projects, it's about shaping a future where private capital is deeply aligned with public good, and where doing well and doing good are no longer seen as separate paths. So with that, I'm really excited to welcome our distinguished speakers, Preeta, Rhett, and Stephen, as we dive deeper into ideas, experiences, and solutions that can help us move from aspiration to action. So let's keep building this movement together. Thank you.
Miha, thank you so much for your words. Unfortunately, I have lost the rostrum privileges, so I have to use this microphone right now. Allow me to do a very brief introduction to today's panel. Now, today's panel challenges us to examine the drivers, the levers to support our philanthropic ecosystem. We propose this concept called catalytic capacity, and we think that it is a critical factor for scaling impact. Now, our distinguished thought leaders who will be here today will provide insights into what it takes to build Asia's engine for good, drawing on grounded experiences. So allow me to introduce very briefly all of our guest speakers for today. First, we have Preeta Venkatachalam of Bridgespan, a trusted advisor to many of the world's leading social impact organizations. We also have Rhett Iyer Butler, founder and chief executive officer at Monger Bay, who champions environmental journalism and transparency in sustainability. Lastly, we have Stephen King, senior advisor to the Omidyar Group. He is a global philanthropic advisor committed to transformative change across sectors. And last but not least, our moderator, Dawn Tan, head of ACC. Now, please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers to the stage. Please.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to see all of you here with us today. Many old friends and many wonderful new friends. It is encouraging for us that there are so many of you gathered here to learn, to take part in a discussion on how we can ignite Asia's engines for good. In her opening address, Miha outlined 5 key enablers for private wealth to drive progress towards our developmental goals. In a very short while, we will go in depth into some of these key enablers. But first of all, let me thank our speakers who took time out from their busy schedules to fly in specially to Singapore to join us at the ACC Forum. Welcome to Singapore, Preeta, Rhett, Stephen. Okay, now let's dive straight into our discussion. Perhaps we can start with, the state of play in Asia. Miha described these current times that we're living in as a pivotal point, an era of tremendous opportunity for Asia. Our wealth has grown. Traditional sources of impact funding are facing pressure, such as USAID and ESG funding. There is potential for Asian philanthropy to rise up to the challenge to catalyze progress towards the United Nations SDGs. But I want to take a step back for now. Philanthropy has been around with us for a very, very long time, well before the UN SDGs came about. If philanthropy can solve the problems, well, we wouldn't have the UN SDGs. So, why do we think that philanthropy can be a part of the solution now? Is there a disconnect between the reality and the potential of philanthropy? And perhaps I can invite Preeta to start first.
Thanks so much, Dawn, and it's great to be here. I thought the last session for the day would have the least attendance, but it's very heartening to see a full room here. So thank you for making time. To your provocative question of what is the role of philanthropy, I think most of us know that philanthropy is actually the tail of the dog, right? Not the dog itself, because it's barely typically 1% to single-digit percentage, depending on the country you work in, of the total social sector spend in a country's economic and social growth. So the role of philanthropy is really to be more catalytic as opposed to solving the entire problem. And where we see philanthropy really playing a big role is to be more creative and to be the risk capital that can enable showing and demonstrating solutions that can work at scale in a country that government or markets or communities can pick up. And even there, I think there's a lot of myth around philanthropy enabling scaled solutions of only one variety, which is scaling across geographies or demographics. And a lot of our work across countries, whether it's in Asia or Africa, have shown that philanthropy can provide not just scaled solutions in terms of scaling out, but also what we call scaling in, which is very place-based, to enable great levels of social justice, poverty alleviation, and better prosperity levels in specific geographies. And the reason I say that right up front is that one needs to meet philanthropy where there is incentive and motivation for them to give. And often, particularly with new wealth owners, we are seeing that some of them might only want to give in the geographies they have grown up in, their home country or home region. Or, for example, certain types of vulnerable populations they feel close to. So it's very important as we look at the role of philanthropy to understand that, A, what is its role? And second, to meet the philanthropist where they are in terms of their cause and incentive to give, to really enable philanthropy to have that catalytic role.
So do you mean that we haven't been able to meet the philanthropists where they are for such a long time? Is that what is missing from this whole question of philanthropy having the potential as catalytic capital?
Yeah, and as Britspan, we did a study last year on looking at the top 20 foundations in Asia and globally, and what are some of the high-impact practices. And we did notice that there are some very unique characteristics for Asian philanthropy. So, when I said meet them where they are, I think it's important to recognize that in this part of the world, there are some very different values, different characteristics. For example, the large number of corporate foundations, state-linked giving, the way we look at values of giving are also quite different from how it might operate, say, in the West. So it's important to structure the role of philanthropy in a way that actually can incentivize greater giving, and often to move from checkbook giving to cause-based giving to outcome-based giving, and then hopefully ultimately to systemic or field-building type roles. There is a journey that every philanthropist or foundation goes through, and I think there it's very important to understand how each country in Asia operates if we really want to unlock greater levels of wealth, like you were mentioning, to fill at least a small portion of the gap that bilateral funding cuts are now resulting in.
Thank you. And please do hold on to that thought of the incentivizing philanthropy and also meeting philanthropists where they are, different risk appetites. We will get onto that in a while. Perhaps I can move on to Stephen.
Sure. I think a lot of what Preeta said was very important, and what Miha introduced with her sort of 5 points earlier on is that the international aid architecture has changed irrevocably. It's not coming back. So, estimates that USAID funding will be cut by about 80%. So that is going to change the landscape completely. And as Miha mentioned earlier on, the UK government is putting more money into defence, the Swedes, the French, the Germans, and so on. So we're seeing a rewriting of the opportunities to reach the SDGs. Private capital can replace some of that, but it needs to step up in a very significant way. And even still, if you put all of the money from all of the philanthropists in the world together, it's not going to replace that money. So it does require, I think, a new look at how both governments fund what was previously funded as aid, and also what private philanthropy can do to play a part. I'm working with the Omidyar Group, and I've worked with Pierre Omidyar, who's the founder of eBay, for many years, looking at the issue of how you encourage philanthropic ecosystems. And they're very different in lots of different places. What works in Brazil is very different from what works in Singapore and so on. And we're doing a study at the moment to look at what are the characteristics of what makes a good philanthropic ecosystem. And Michal touched on many of them earlier on. It's about professionalization. It's about seeing philanthropy, not only the advisors as a career, but also the professional staff, to get them to step up and to make this a career option. It's also about making sure we have proper data on measuring philanthropy. I think I've found that someone told me that there's only 18 countries in the world that regularly collect data on their philanthropy, which is shocking, really, when you think about it. And I don't know how many countries in Asia do that on a regular basis, but that is something that should be just measuring what is happening, and also to avoid duplication and replication and so on. I'm sure we'll talk about this in a little while as well, but the importance of collaboration, of making sure that philanthropies are working together, because the big, hairy goals and objectives they have are more than one person or one family can try and hope to address.
Thank you, Stephen. And Rhett?
Yes, I mean, there's been a lot of great points here made. I think just to, I guess, add a little bit would be taking a step back and at a higher level. I think, philanthropy, whether it's in Asia or other parts of the world, is still often too fragmented. And so there's a need for more collaborative action across different funders, but also different types of funders. I think philanthropy is often too short term as well. So there's this, there's a greater need for patient capital, which funds things like capacity and leadership and things like that, which is absolutely critical. And then also, philanthropy is supposed to, should be willing to take on risk. And so there's still a lot of adverseness to risk with a lot of philanthropy. And so, it's critical to get beyond this. And so we really need to shift from, bringing these things together, shifting from looking at the symptoms that, cause problems in the world to focusing on the engines that drive solutions. Because a lot of the problems that philanthropy is trying to solve, if they were if it was easy for NGOs or anyone to solve these, they wouldn't still be problems. So I think that's also important to think about.
The systems change perspective. Yeah. Thank you. And having talked about various issues here, so I think we can bucket them really into impact capital, right? Where philanthropic capital can be seen as risk capital and asset class in itself, where philanthropists with different risk appetites may be able to get involved so that we can expand the pie. So it's not just 0% return on their investments, but we can start looking at expanding the pie of funders so that we capture those who are interested in funding impact with financial returns. So that's one, impact capital. And we talked about human capital. Stephen, you talked a bit about the professionalizing of professionals in this space. So we want to go into that a bit more later. And collaboration, of course. We talked about that. So I want to go into each of these more deeply. Are there other areas, other levers that you think that we should be looking at?
Yeah, I think the three that you mentioned are really important, and we should definitely go deeper to understand how they work in the Asian context. I think the fourth one that I might add is on the community side, because a lot of the work that philanthropy does is often designed at headquarters and just rolled out or executed on the ground. And now there's clear evidence and data that shows that unless you not just identify the needs, but also co-design and co-execute with the communities in need, building their resilience and their power, most of this impact will not be lasting or equitable. So I would say that's probably the one angle where, if you look at the role of philanthropy in the next decade, I certainly hope that, with the dismantling of some of the bilateral aid structures, the silver lining could be that there is a lot more proximate, localized solutions that can stick even after the external funding reduces.
Great, great. So we have a lot of ground to cover. 4 areas: impact capital, how do we look at philanthropy as an asset class? Human capital, how do we professionalize the sector? Collaborative capital, how do we build partnerships that work among funders? And community capital, how can we work with community hand in hand? Great. Perhaps we dive into the first factor first, and that's we want to pay a lot of attention to that, impact capital, looking at philanthropy as an asset class. So there has been a lot of interest in philanthropic investing in Asia through approaches like impact investing, venture philanthropy, blended finance, etc. But that interest has not really translated into deployment. Exact numbers are hard to come by, but Asian investors are estimated to hold only about 10 to 15% share of the global impact investing market. And even then, these are mostly institutional investors. Stephen and Rhett, both of you come from Europe and the US. These are regions that are farther ahead in terms of impact investing. They dominate the impact investing market. Would love to hear your thoughts on how private wealth can be involved. And Stephen, of course, you come from, you have worked with the Omidyar Group for a long time, and Pierre is a huge believer in having financial returns for social impact. Would love to hear you share more about that.
Okay, perhaps I should start. I mean, I think it's a really important part of the overall philanthropic market. It is, I think, difficult to do, and you also require patient capital over many years, and I think that sometimes puts off institutional investors or more traditional venture investors, because they're expecting a return much more quickly than really any social impact bonds or development impact bonds, which are some of the more sort of common mechanisms have proven. And I think going back over the last sort of 15 years or so, the birth of sort of impact investing in the US and in Europe happened probably in the sort of late 2000s, early 2010 onwards. But it also required an ecosystem approach as well. So in the UK, where I'm from, there were a number of bodies that were set up, an organization called Social Finance, and there were impact investors associations. And these were both supported and helped by government and given the sort of platforms and runways. And also it required significant leaders to emerge. And so there was national impact investing bodies. There was one in the US, there's one in the UK, there are a number in Germany and other parts of Europe as well. And that sort of development of an asset class grew over a number of years, and also, frankly, had ups and downs. And I think there was a big interest in social impact bonds and development impact bonds in the early 2010s, 2012s, and so on. That tends to have tapered off, I think, partly because the outcomes of those bonds were going to be underwritten by bilateral organizations. So if bilateral organizations such as FCDO or USAID and so on are withdrawing funds, that also takes some of the outcome guarantees out of those as well. Right. It is important, I think, to continue to build that asset base, and I think where we're seeing more interest is from things like pension funds and so on, as there is more of a demand, or there has been up till now, for ESG requirements and so on. Again, that is somewhat under threat in some places.
So you would see that the government has a key role to play. Institutional investors tend to come in first, and then you start to see private wealth coming in.
Yeah.
Rhett, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes there's a bit of a mismatch of expectations. So philanthropy wants social returns, but impact investors want financial returns. And so, again, it's kind of a joke sometimes. I live in Silicon Valley. It's kind of a joke sometimes. Local NGOs, there's when you go to an event and there's a bunch of impact investors, it's like, well, the NGOs don't want to talk to the impact investors because they're just going to look for, return on their capital. Whereas, as working for an NGO, I can offer a 100% loss in your investment, but you're going to get impact as a trade-off. And so, it depends on the impact investor you're dealing with, but that's, it's kind of like an extreme case. But I think to build off, what Stephen said, so I think one thing that's really important is thinking about how to fund organizational resilience. So thinking about, building the leadership and the other capacity, and so within an organization. And so I think like a lot of times, especially with people who are new to philanthropy, you may think about overhead as, or capacity as being overhead, but in reality, you can't build an engine that's going to grow impact without having, that kind of the supportive infrastructure to make that happen. So it's really important. I think a third area, which isn't talked about a lot, is the idea of having clear entry points for people who are new to philanthropy. And so I have an example from several years ago where there was an entrepreneur in this region who had an IPO and an exit. And so he knew he wanted to get involved with conservation, but he didn't know what he wanted to do. He just knew that he wanted to do something different. And so we had a conversation, and I proposed an idea where we would put a bunch of journalists out to look at what we were calling almost famous animals. And so they were species that were at risk. The stories would look at those species, talk about what the conservation need was, and including dollars and things like that. And so he funded the project, and what was interesting is after all those stories came out, that ended up shaping his philanthropy. So he created a fund that then provided grants to local organizations that were working on those species conservation efforts. And so by providing sort of this like very, it was unique way for him to engage with this area, then he could build a whole philanthropic philosophy around it. So again, a key thing was just creating that entry point.
Just one thing to add, I think, is that the important thing to bear in mind is impact, and that for philanthropists should trump all. Is that the most important thing is impact, and there are different pathways to impact. Some are grant giving, and some, as you say, Rhett, you're guaranteed to have 100% loss of capital there. But even within impact investing, the most important thing is the impact that you're going to have rather than return on investment. And that always was an important thing within the Omidyar group, was that there were different ways in which you could fund things, both from a 501c3 foundation, but also through an LLC. But even with the LLC, the important thing was you could have a return on investment, but the reason that Pierre was in it was for impact.
Right. Just 1 minute. Could you share a little bit about Pierre's journey, how he came to that way of thinking?
Sure. Well, very briefly, because when eBay floated, which was in 1999, suddenly Pierre became very wealthy, and he remembered having a conversation with a philanthropist who said, whatever you do, don't set up a family foundation. And so he went back and talked to his lawyers and the finance people, and they said, what are you talking about? You've got to set up a family foundation. It's tax efficient and so on. But his experience in creating eBay was that he created a platform through which more than 1 million people earned a living. And so that was a social impact, which was unexpected, but which he thought, okay, so there is a for-profit company here which has also created a social impact as well. So he did set up a family foundation, but then very, very quickly turned it into an LLC as well, a limited liability company, to allow him to make for-profit investments into companies that had a social impact. So that was the expectation of a return on investment, but also risk, not Google-type returns. The expectation, and always the underlying reason for doing this, was the impact that he sought to have.
Right. So yes, please do set up foundations, and you can set up a separate vehicle for investing. Preetha, you were going to say.
No, I was just about to say that, the term now is almost becoming impact-first investing, because just like we've heard the term greenwashing, there's a lot of impact washing, sadly, that happens in the term impact capital. Like even if I look at India, where I come from, a lot of the impact investing happens in kind of the more, take the creamiest layer of the sector and call it impact investing. In fact, someone was joking that post-COVID, we manufacture soap. So we are also into impact investing because we're improving hygiene and sanitation in the country. So, where do you actually draw the line on calling something impact, I think is important. I would underscore the point that Stephen said, that there is a critical role that governments can play to be an enabler, while at the same time providing that productive environment for philanthropy to flourish. Like in the United States, we know the tax regime has been particularly helpful. In the social finance, UK is a great case in point where it helped the growth of development social impact bonds. And I would encourage this room and beyond to think more creatively about what products can actually enable that spectrum of impact capital. If I look at Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, they had the advanced market commitment, the International Finance Facility for Immunization, now more than a decade ago, which really helped get millions of dollars for immunization. But really, if each of us put on our thinking caps, there haven't been that many new products that have built real solution-led products for social impact. So can we, as a collective community, think of, like you said, the spectrum of impact capital, where grants and philanthropic support play a very important role, but what else is possible with bringing the best of financial engineering possibilities for the impact space? And I don't think we've quite cracked that nut in most sectors we work in.
Right. And I think this ties in very closely with what Miha was talking about earlier in terms of improving access to impact opportunities, the products, what are the platforms that we need to put in place in order to improve access to these offerings as well. Preeta, I also wanted to ask, India actually is one of the most active countries in Asia in impact investing, including private wealth. How did that happen?
So I don't think there's any one or two specific trends that really helped take it off. But I think a decade ago, when corporate social responsibility became part of India's legal regulatory requirement, there was a lot of backlash saying, how can one make CSR mandatory? That has to come from corporates. But 10 years down, there's actually a lot less skepticism because it had many unintended positive consequences. The most intended one, of course, 2% of net profits being given for social impact. But it also helped professionalize the sector because, what was earlier considered a retirement job or where you don't need money and somebody's just coming in to do good in the social sector actually became a lot more professional because you had corporate leaders take more of an interest and pay attention to what it means to provide impact. And I think that was definitely one trend that enabled new wealth makers, those who became unicorns in the financial services or other service industries, also develop a deep understanding of what it means for social impact. We did a survey of CSR funders in India a few years ago, and when we looked at the motivation to give, majority of them said compliance. But when we repeated that survey a few years later, many had moved from compliance mindset to an impact mindset.
Fantastic.
And I think that did help us understand that while you might have started giving with just being compliant legally, you had to be in touch with the communities. You did have governance to ensure you're reporting to the board on what the outcomes, if not impact, of your investments have been. And you had more people interested in taking careers in the social impact space. So I would say that is definitely one of the very palpable, tangible differences in India for growing interest in giving.
Oh, so perhaps we should start looking at that. But it seems like Asia is on the right track with government, well, like in Singapore, there is a lot of government support for philanthropy. And of course, Temasek Trust is building this whole ecosystem. There's a lot of, in a sense, top-down encouragement for philanthropy to thrive. What do you see as the role of financial institutions? How can they be a part of this whole ecosystem? Because they play such a key role in enabling capital, the flow of capital. Is there a role for them? Or perhaps do you have examples of how financial institutions have played a key role?
I mean, I think to build on what Peter said, I mean, I think financial institutions being a exemplar in terms of CSR is one role they can play. I think also with some of the private banks, there are also philanthropy advisors within private banks. But I've had conversations with a number of private banks here and also in Switzerland as well. And this kind of area of wealth advisory, I think, is something that they have an important part to play. I know here, for example, UBS plays an important role with the Optimus Foundation.
Yes, and I
and
think
so
we have
on.
some UBS colleagues here.
Yeah. So that's a couple of examples, I think, of what they can play.
For sure. Yeah. But how about in terms of offerings and structuring products, for example?
Yeah, I think on the financial products, given first loss guarantees or even providing debt equity capital, of course, it partly depends on the regulatory environment in the country. Like in India, it's very strict. So banks and financial institutions have very heavy regulatory scrutiny. But within the bounds of that, they have been able to partner with nonprofits and social enterprises to come up with more mezzanine-type offerings that can provide some impact capital alongside a grant funder who provides for the most marginalized populations. So for example, if I look at healthcare, there's a portion of healthcare that needs 100% subsidy for the poorest of the poor, or you need some state-level sponsored or insurance-based healthcare. And there you don't see beyond CSR or philanthropic capital. But in the middle tier, where you need professionalization of healthcare workers or providing hospitals with infrastructure, I think financial institutions can play a key role in providing products that have kind of longer gestation for development impact or impact capital-like features that can enable crowding in of other forms of capital. So I think for me, the bar is about, can you crowd in more market capital if you're providing services to those who can afford it? Or can you enable more philanthropic capital to provide technical support for the poorest of the poor? And I think in that middle tier, financial institutions that have regulatory freedoms to come up with products, I think, can do a lot.
Right. So it seems like there's a role for everyone in terms of trying to encourage impact capital. Role for government, for institutional investors, for philanthropy advisors, for financial institutions. That's a cue to move to the next topic that we want to talk about, human capital, professionalizing the talent pool. And, we spoke a little bit about that earlier, and of course, Miha mentioned in her speech the training of the philanthropy advisors. Our region, Southeast Asia, is in short supply of philanthropy professionals. What is the situation in your part of the world? Perhaps, Red, would you like to start?
Yeah, I would say that the U.S. has one of the more advanced ecosystems for the human capital side of philanthropy. Like I feel in a lot of places where philanthropy may be newer, at least institutional philanthropy may be newer, philanthropy is seen as sort of like a hobby. It's not necessarily a professional path. It might be something you do for a while to move on to something else. Whereas in the U.S. you have tracks that take people all the way from when they graduate to leading philanthropic foundations. And so there's, it's integrated with consulting firms and finance firms. So there's this entire ecosystem, which is, I think, really critical for creating both supply and demand for philanthropic professionals.
Are there degrees in the universities for philanthropy advising?
I believe there are. I mean, there certainly are in Switzerland. I believe there are in the U.S.
I mean, there's I think the most famous one in the US is the Lilly School at Indiana University, and you're right, in Geneva there are others as well. And I think the absence of that professional pathway is something that we're seeing not only in Asia, but also in Latin America and Africa as well. And I think the creation of those opportunities, both the demand side for fundraising, for example. So for fundraisers to be asking philanthropists for money is also something that is a skill and is also something that needs to be developed as a profession as well. Because that, philanthropists are only going to give if they're asked. So there needs to be some attention kind of paid to that as well. And then I think the other elements in that kind of ecosystem are, for example, the kind of, the verification platforms in the US, for example, there's GuideStar, and there's others as well, which provide some sort of level of kind of verification or quality control around the organizations that one would fund. So I think those things also are part of a more mature ecosystem. I mean, in the UK, where I'm from, there's been a growth in the last 10 years in recruitment agencies that just focus on the non-profit sector and just focus on philanthropy.
Right.
That seems to be absent here. I know, Preeta, you were saying there's some in India. And so that is also something that is part of that professionalization journey as well.
Very true. Preeta.
I mean, to be honest, I think there's a breakdown both on the supply and demand side for talent. Like Rhett was saying, we have an initiative at Britspan called Pay What It Takes, which is don't just pay for programs. In fact, Omidyar Network was one of our anchor supporters in building that philosophy and ethos in the sector to say, pay for true impact, which includes professional costs, investing in the human resources of the nonprofit sector. Just as an anecdote, one of my friends whose daughter wanted to start her career in the nonprofit space, the parents came and told me, can you please counsel my son? He wants to join an NGO straight after engineering. And I was like, isn't that great? They're like, no, he needs to make money. So, there's such a rhetoric that if somebody is good and doing well professionally, the nonprofit sector cannot be your career or home. Yes. And I think that needs to break to what Rhett was just talking about, the United States ecosystem. And the biggest issue there is that nonprofits don't pay well. I mean, the same professional who works in the for-profit corporate sector might earn multiples of the person who joins the NGO sector. So I think there is a supply issue. And I think on the demand side, we published a report early on in the first year of Britspan India to show the deficit in the second line of leadership in nonprofits. And a big revelation was that the average life tenure of a founder of a nonprofit in the United States, guess what, was how many years? Was about 3 to 5 years. I mean, they still continued, but they continued as a chairperson, a non-executive role, senior advisor on average. There are some, of course, that are outliers. And in India, can you guess? It was 20 plus years, average, where the founders don't leave the nonprofit as the chief executive.
Right.
So
India pays very well.
No, but because most of them are passion-based projects after they've retired from, or they have ancestral wealth. But that just showed the lack of investment in professionalizing leadership, building the second line. And we put out a data-driven report on this. And in the last 6 years, there have been at least 4 or 5 institutions that have been set up in India that build leadership for nonprofit sectors. They provide professional training. They provide courses like ISDM, the Institute of in the School of Development Management. There's another institution called India Leaders Social Sector. All of these have been set up in the last 6 to 7 years. So there is a huge need to also prime the pump to create talent.
Right, for sure. I mean, I think we agree. There is a need for funders, for the whole ecosystem to think about paying for impact, and that includes philanthropy advisory and, the support services that impact organizations offer, whether it's fundraising or paying for the infrastructure. So the need to pay for capacity building of the impact organizations. I want to move on to talk about collaboration. Preeta, I know that Britspan has done a lot of work in the area of collaborative capital. And perhaps you have even been involved in coordinating some of these partnerships. Can you share an example of how collaboration in philanthropy has resulted in outsized impact?
I mean, I think the jury is, to be frank, still out on what's the impact. But I was joking in another convening I spoke at where we are looking at building ecosystems with collaborations, but actually first you need to manage ecosystems before you can actually build collaborations, because all philanthropists want full control. All philanthropists want attribution, if they're even willing to look at contribution to results. All of them want to have a share in the success, and it's very difficult when you're looking at one audacious goal that's built through collaboration to say, philanthropist X can be attributed X million lives saved versus philanthropist Y. So I think, one, there is a need to understand, what does collaborative capital really mean? And second, to also understand that for collaborations, one needs to actually give up some control and look at ways to communicate, coordinate better. So there is a high cost of collaborating. And when we looked at collaborations across Asia and Africa, which we work very deeply in, almost all of them that have thrived and gone on to the next phase of impact have been those where the benefits of collaborating have far exceeded the cost. And what do I mean by that? First, they've provided innovations or more risky initiatives which going alone might have been very difficult. So for example, that could be more free journalism, or looking at climate or child protection, very sensitive issues where, if you're alone, then tackling the government or tackling the issue might be very difficult or perceived as risky. Second, where you want to achieve scaled impact. It could be scaled geographically or, as I mentioned upfront, place-based, depending on the interest. There is a benefit to collaboration. Right. Third, to field building and systemic change, where you look not just at the symptomatic issues, but really the root cause, which can take couple of decades or more. There's, again, benefit to collaboration. So we've seen those three areas in particular have a lot more benefit to collaborate compared to going alone.
Right, right.
Maybe just to build on that, I mean, I think there is a lot of, Preeta's right, I think there's a lot of talk about good collaboration, but there's not very many examples of where that happens because of all the reasons you'd mentioned about the requirement to put a flag on something and to take credit for it and so on. I think, however, it is really important to step back and say, some of the problems that we're trying to solve are far greater than the combined resources of all the philanthropists. So, for example, I'll give you one example of Luminate's work, and I was the CEO of that until the end of the year, which was working on tech accountability, so on mis and disinformation. And part of the problem was the social media platforms like Facebook and so on. And when we compare what Luminate's budget was, which was a very generous $100 million a year, Facebook's public affairs budget in Europe alone is $160 million. So that is a problem that we're not going to be able to solve. So what that requires is a bunch of different organizations who share that particular objective getting together. So what we did was created an aligned funding pool in Europe, which was called, terrible name, but FABI, Funders for a Better Internet. But what it meant was that we were able to combine 8 large foundations' efforts to work towards a series of issues. And the important thing here was to define what is the common purpose rather than what is it that I can get out of it for my principal and for my donor and so on. And that, I think, was the key, is that no one organization owned it and no one organization was driving it. And that, I think, has been a successful example. Now, those are unfortunately very rare, and we've been involved in ones that have been terrible as well in the past. So, but I think it avoids duplication. It means you're able to aggregate much larger amounts of money for common purpose. And also it's a peer learning effort as well, which is important.
Right.
Yeah, I would just add one more thing on that, which it also can go beyond money. You can come together and have strategy and also apply political pressure, find other allies. So, I mean, just one example, I think, which is very relevant to this is the Climate and Land Use Alliance, which focused on, I think it formed in 2010, and it was several foundations, Packard, Ford, Moore Foundation, and they were trying to address deforestation and agricultural sustainability. And so these funders came together, but they still had a lot of autonomy, but they could strategize about how we could partner together, come up with common standards, because we also have to think about the grantees. And so if a grantee has to provide different materials and metrics and impact measurement to each different funder, it gets very expensive. And so there's some coordination going on with funders so you can simplify it. It also helps the grantees.
Right, right. Yeah, like what all of you mentioned, the cost of collaboration, right? That you seed ego, you seed control, and there is cost to having, to coordination, to having shared services, but the impact, the benefits can be outsized. Well, so what do we need to put in place? Is there infrastructure, networks that we need to put in place to encourage more of these catalytic collaborations in Asia?
So I think there's definitely need for a lot of infrastructure. We have just launched something called a Collaboratives Resource Hub in India. And when we launched it, we thought we'll have to take it to market, but the doors are being beaten down because there's just so little infrastructure. So one, what does it take to set up a backbone organization that's going to run the collaborative? In fact, I think anybody who runs a backbone organization, disclaimer, you're going to have more white hair than anybody else in the social sector because you're going to have to manage not just different funders, but different implementing organizations, maybe even government in your country, etc. Second, monitoring, learning, evaluation, because as Stephen said, these are the big social change, more difficult issues where the benefit of collaborating could exceed costs. But the flip side to it is that how are you going to report on results? It's not going to be easy. It's going to be multi-year with no quick metrics quarter by quarter. So again, to your point, you need infrastructure around monitoring, learning, evaluation that is distinctive for collaborative action compared to individual philanthropic action. And the third tricky one is governance, because when you're looking at millions of dollars being deployed through collaborative action, you do want accountability. Technology can play a big role, but how do you ensure strong governance so that, even if you're sensitive that not all reporting is quantitative, it could be aggregated, a mix of qualitative, community-level response, but you still need strong governance in terms of the board, the committees, and how do you look at collaborative scaling their impact?
Right. You mentioned the Collaborative Resource Hub. That's interesting. So that is available to, how is that made available to funders?
So the Collaboratives Resource Hub, which we launched last August, so it's less than a year in, has been co-funded by 3 or 4 funders working in India as a public good to be an infrastructure support to anyone who wants to do collaborative work in philanthropic action and social impact in India. To keep it simple, it looks at 3 Ds, which I call as discover. So discover partnerships who might be likely values-aligned, mission-aligned partners. The second D is design, because often people are so busy firefighting and with their day jobs, designing a big bet for collaborative action is not easy. You need infrastructure and professional support. And the third D is disseminate best practices, whether it's with governance, MEL. So the Resource Hub looks at the design, discover, and disseminate elements which you need as a public good in the sector, because not every philanthropist, every nonprofit has the bandwidth to do it solo.
Right, right. So does it actually implement projects?
So it stops at design right now because we're only about 8 months in, but we're trying to identify a series of implementing agencies that can then take over after the design stage.
Fascinating.
So let's see. I mean, maybe next year this time we can see how it's
Yeah, can report back. Okay, let's move on to, I'm conscious of time, so I want to move on to community capital, what you mentioned earlier, Preeta. Perhaps we can start with RET. You lead a nonprofit organization, and at the same time, you are a funder yourself. So how can funders, intermediaries, impact organizations work better together? Whereby, funders, we want to address this power imbalance that funders and impact organizations often face. How can we encourage community-led change and solutions that are that can be sustainable because they are led and accepted by the communities themselves?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is listening. So I think a lot of times philanthropy, as many other parts of the world tend to be very top down, and so there's not actually that feedback coming in, and so it's absolutely critical to understand what the needs actually are, but also thinking about things like reporting requirements, because they can be quite onerous for communities. And if they don't have any state, so it can be very difficult for them to first access funding, but then, provide feedback on the results they've actually achieved. So that would probably be my overarching theme here. I think, beyond that, transparency is also important. So several years ago, I started a prize that was recognizing innovation in conservation. And, I thought it would be well received because I'm doing this thing, it's, it's for good. The problem was that because there's no disclosure of the actual process, ended up getting criticized. And so it sort of undermined the whole point of the prize because I wasn't transparent about how the whole process worked. And so it just echoed, like, you actually need to listen and then show how the process works so people can understand how they can be part of it. So I guess, there's a lot of other things, but maybe I should let you two jump in.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example.
Yeah, I think listening is a really important part of involving communities in the decision making, and also for philanthropists to kind of learn and take a step back. We mentioned earlier on, I think the value of unrestricted funding and patient capital over a period of time is also really important to allow community-based organizations not to go in annual cycles where they're having to spend half the year coming back and asking for money again, but to get a commitment over a longer period of time. And I think also the beyond the grant support. Within the Omidyar Group, we put a big emphasis on not only providing financial capital, but also helping with human capital requirements as well. Sometimes that can be support to governance, it can be support to management, to their financial systems, to their fundraising, to their communications. And as often as not, organizations, when they give feedback to us and say, well, look, the money actually was really helpful, but also what was helpful was the advice that you gave us, or the advisors you and the consultants that you made available to us to work through different problems and so on.
Rita.
Yeah, plus one to everything they said. I know interest is fading as we're all getting tired at the end of the day. So I'll just end with a small story that really exemplifies for me what community-centeredness for philanthropy and impact capital could mean. So during COVID, India had, as you know, one of the most stringent lockdowns imposed overnight. And with the best intentions, philanthropies decided to go to the slums of Mumbai, which, as you know, is about 40% of Mumbai's population, to provide food and water, because most of these urban poor populations did not have any source of livelihoods because they had day jobs. So a lot of these philanthropists gave food, cooked food and rations, dry food that people could go back home and cook. And you had people lining up in queues as far as your eyes could see, standing with their plates and glasses to just get food to survive for not just themselves, but the elderly at their homes, babies who had no source of food otherwise. 1 month in, we did a study. We interviewed some of the communities there. And the biggest thing, believe it or not, what we heard was not gratitude for the food, which I'm sure they had, but the complete loss of dignity. Because all of these people said, till last year, I not only fed my home, but I could feed my neighbors because I did an honest, hard labor day job and I could earn money. So that same input, when it went to the philanthropists, from month 3 of the lockdown, instead of becoming food aid, they set up a food kitchen. Right. So the same amount of dollars, but instead of distributing food where people had to queue up, like major loss of dignity, they actually set up a community kitchen where the people from the slum area themselves came in to cook, and then you had people who had local transport jobs who distributed it door to door for those who could not come to the kitchen and take their food. And to me, that really encapsulated what philanthropy could do differently if you were community-rooted versus designing from the outside and hoping that communities take it up and sustain it.
Right. So really a mindset shift. Yes, Stephen?
Just one to add on on that. I think there are very few philanthropies that actually involve beneficiaries on their boards. And that is something that I would encourage.
Right.
Where you've had grantees or you've had beneficiaries or representatives of organizations in that governing structure and helping to define the strategy is transformative.
Right. That's a great idea. Yes, Rhett.
Well, Stephen just stole my idea, but I guess I guess you could say,
You need
have
to be
shift out-
philanthropic about it.
Yeah, power sharing. So, I mean, you can't empower communities without actually sharing some power with them. But I guess also something else that we haven't named it, but it's been implicit here is just, the concept of trust-based philanthropy.
Yep.
So that's obviously very critical in all this discussion.
Right, right. I want to open the questions, welcome questions from the floor. I know that we have hogged the time, but I did want to address these issues before we start this conversation with the floor. Any burning questions that you might have for any of our speakers? Perhaps Natalie first, and then we move on. If you could introduce yourself, Natalie.
Sure. Thanks, Dawn. I'm Natalie from Real Impact Advisors. We're based here. I'm curious from each of you, but maybe start with Rhett. How far does a dollar go? What is catalytic? What's the best example you've seen of philanthropy in your work?
Think about that one. The best. I mean. The best example. I mean, obviously, I think that the work that the reason I started what I do is because I think it's highly catalytic. But the whole idea is that you look for ways to enable an entire group of actors across the ecosystem. And so, for us, it's journalism, but that applies in various different ways. And so, we're always trying to figure out what is where can we have the highest marginal impact. And so, it depends on what your criteria are. And, when I did this evaluation, I shifted, my organization, when it was just me in my pajamas, it was advertising based as a for-profit. And then it became a nonprofit, and when I went from ads to impact, we went from having 2 staff to 125 staff and 1,000 contributors around the world. So that's just a very specific example to me because that's what I can think of right now, but there you go.
I mean, it's an impossible question to answer in a way, and I think sometimes we get caught up in this sort of what is the utile of social impact? Is it more valuable to educate a girl in Kenya than it is to build a forest in Brazil? And the things are entirely different. I think one thing which I'm seeing, which is I think very catalytic, is an investment in ecosystems. There's a foundation in Brazil which is called Instituto Beja, and it was set up just to fund the ecosystem of philanthropy in Brazil. And it's a woman called Chris Soltani, who's the heiress to the biggest orange juice manufacturer in the whole of Latin America. And she took the decision 5 years ago to fund other philanthropies and other ecosystems. I think that's really far-sighted because the ripple effect of that is going to improve philanthropy across Brazil.
Yeah, I would agree on ecosystem level. The other one is where you have actionable data. So for example, the annual survey of education report in India was philanthropically funded. Till then, there was no survey on education, and India was focusing on getting children into schools, i.e. the enrollment and attendance issue. And then the annual survey of education report pointed out that learning outcomes were terrible. Like somebody in 6th grade actually were working at 2nd grade level, not just students, but also teachers. So it completely shifted not just government policy, but philanthropic action in schools by teachers, educators, to put a spotlight on learning outcomes, not just get a human body into school, but what are they actually learning in the classroom? And to me, that was really fantastic return on the dollar spent on providing very evidence-based data that was actionable, not just by philanthropy, but the wider ecosystem.
Another question?
Hi, thanks everybody. Great session. I'm Daisy. I work with Environmental Grant Makers Network, Australian philanthropists. The funders I talk to often seem to have a really high risk appetite when they're talking about their investment portfolio when it comes to their philanthropy, they often seem like quite risk averse. And I'm interested in how do you build the confidence when it comes to their philanthropy so that they'll be more risky.
Perhaps I can take that, having worked with a philanthropist who has a very high risk appetite, is that sometimes you have to talk him down from taking risks. And that's an unusual situation. But I think is also, as Rhett said at the very beginning, I think that's the purpose of philanthropy, is to take risks and to be experimental. It can be a supporter to government initiatives. It can, provide all of the, support to public goods and so on. But I think the best use of philanthropic dollars is, as we said at the beginning, it's not going to replace bilateral aid, is to do frontier issues, is to work on the issues that are going to be tricky, unpopular, and difficult.
Another way might be to reframe it as, failure is an opportunity to learn. So it's not a total loss.
Very good.
So just on that point, last year, the Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies in India, who are also signatories to the Giving Pledge, started a philanthropy failure conclave, which is now an annual issue. So that philanthropists take pride in, but of course, I mean, I say that with a pinch of salt because we are dealing with lives here. So, while it is risk capital, how can you marry moral accountability with taking risk? And I mean, we can speak much more about it offline. But one other solution that I've seen work well is taking philanthropists to the field. Because when you see the communities in need, which is not your regular echo chamber that you're exposed to in, whether it's corporate or the urban upper class societal exposure that you get, taking them to the field actually makes them realize what their philanthropic capital can really enable. And at least in a lot of our work in Asia and Africa, we've seen some of the best innovations emerge when the principals actually travel to the field.
Right. And I absolutely agree. We need to speak more about failures. I think we all have been involved in programs, projects that have not done well, and we don't want to speak about them, but we should, so that other people can learn. And we learn ourselves as well. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thanks a lot for the wonderful conversation. We're now observing more and more social enterprises are coming up. So moving from the traditional nonprofits, we're also seeing social enterprises driving the public good. How are you warming up the philanthropic network and the collaboratives to support the social enterprises?
I mean, maybe I can address that. I think it's critical, and that part of the pathways to impact is to involve a range of different actors. So if you're dealing with education, for example, there's going to be a place for non-profit organizations to be able to deal with the poorest, perhaps, and also to be able to also influence policy and influence government as well. But I think there are also, within any sector, most sectors, I would say, there is normally an opportunity for social enterprises to take a part as well. I think it depends on the different context and the environment and the regulatory environment in which they're working. Sometimes there is more encouragement for social enterprises in some countries than in others. I know in India there is, but in other parts of the world in which I've worked, it's been much more difficult to get that off the ground.
Thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time, unfortunately, so I'm going to bring this session to a close. But I believe our speakers will still be available for perhaps a few more minutes if you want to catch them. Thank you. You have been a great audience. Shaz, over to you.
So is the applause for me or for the speakers? I hope it's for the speakers, right? Thank you all so much for all your questions. If we didn't get to your question, or if you prefer to ask your question in private, please do feel free to reach out to our speakers, or reach out to us. We'll help to direct the questions as well. We certainly hope that you found today's session enlightening, hopefully a little bit more inspiring. Now, before you leave, could you please take a moment to scan the QR code right now on the screen? So this is to help us with regards to feedback. Your input will be very valuable to us in helping us improve our program and in terms of finding potential topics for future research and for future thought leadership events like today. Until then, see you for the next one. Thank you.